I don't know, but just there's some that
interesting.
like milk chocolate is so enraptured with other things in them that it would be weird to think about having it with dark. But maybe it would be better. I don't know. It's just hard to imagine it.
Yeah, if we're talking caramel chocolate, like the Ghirardelli chocolate with the caramel inside,
Squares.
that's A.
Yeah.
That's A tier. That's A tier for me.
Well, I was just gonna say.
All right,
what a
getting
great
started.
segue,
Good morning.
Wade.
Wednesday here in
Because
Australia,
there
Sydney.
is a kind of chocolate
Been out of
you
training
can
for at least the
directly
last
compare,
5 days,
almost
so
directly
don't know if I'm itching to get back into it, but you know, I'm always wondering to myself, man, like, is this where I drop off and life just hits me and I start packing on like fat and whatnot. Just had a bit of reduced motivation at the beginning of this week. Let's just had a bit of a big weekend, and now my workout paid for it on Monday. Last Friday, work called in halfway, and then they're like, "Oh, Daniel, we need you to come in now." I'm like, oh, "Okay." At least I got half 3 sets done. I'd say that's about a third of my workout, but you know, it is what it is. You do what you can, and forward. Missed out Monday though, so that's a day of training that I will never get back. That's a day of improvements that will never come back to me. Really shows how much importance is when it comes to time. That's just my way of guilt tripping and making sure that I stay on top of my training. Right. Anyway, let's get started. Gonna continue on from last week. Gonna do weighted pull-ups with that bag over there, 5 kilo weight. I'll see how I feel. I'm trying to some like online stats. No, not stats. Some people are just like, yeah, try to get to at least half your body weight when you're doing that sort of stuff. And like, so half of mine is like, I don't know, blah, 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 37 and a half, I guess, around there. And I can barely do 5 kilos for one set. Maybe that's the efficiency I'm looking for to reduce the amount of sets I need to do. Lower reps, but higher weight. That's one way to work around it, but I'll see how I feel. Oh man, should I do the 10? Let's just add the 10. Let's see how I feel when I put 10 kilos in there. Because I did the 10 2 weeks ago and I knew I was not going to get far, but isn't that the point of working out? To get to a point where you're like, oh, okay, I need to improve on this. But I want to at least be able to get to 3 sets if that's the case. If it's 10, even 10 kilos. Like, it shouldn't be hard. It shouldn't be. I'm using 2 arms and everything and all that. So. Alright, let's just get started. Anyway, as usual, listening to stuff in the background. Distractable if anyone's interested.
Compare dark to milk chocolate in the same context. And that is Mounds bars versus almond. Oh,
Joy?
what are those called?
Almond Joy?
Almond Joy. That's the one. The picture is really small and hard to see.
So Mounds versus Almond Joy.
So yeah, so Almond Joy is coconut, shredded coconut mixed with it's like a kind of a creamy filling. It's like thick, but it's like coconut flavored. It has an almond on it, and it's covered in milk chocolate. Mounds is the exact same thing without the almond, covered in dark chocolate. So it's pretty one-to-one type comparison.
I have an answer.
We can
Also,
rate
I
them
don't know if I can
separately
trust the
if you
door
guys
to take
have
this
strong
weight.
opinions,
No.
or they can go together.
Whatever.
But where would you put those?
You mind if I go?
Yeah, go.
Sacrifices.
Trash. Both trash.
Ooh,
Both right in the trash.
I agree with Mark.
I don't like coconut.
Whoa.
I don't like
I'm not
coconut.
a coconut. The coconut thing doesn't do it for me.
Yeah, I don't like the crunch between the teeth. I don't like the way it squishes. I don't like the flavor. It's too much. Throw it away.
From the time I was a child till now, those are the ones the first ones I give away to my those are bottom of straight into the trash.
They go. Yeah. Bob, you look so
I'm sorry, Bob. I'm sorry. Oh yeah, I forgot you could see my face.
Yeah.
This is my honest reaction. I knew the moment you brought him up, I was like, oh, I'm gonna break that poor man's heart.
Alright, that's not
Well,
too bad. 10
I was
kilos is not too
afraid
bad at
of
all.
that
Right, I'm gonna keep to
because
this.
I know
This is awesome.
that that's a common opinion about those. Coconut is surprisingly divisive.
Left shoulder's a bit out there.
In general, it's divisive in desserts, and I feel like in savory food as well. I like it in pina coladas. That's it. Nothing else. It's like coconut curry.
I'll try to do a video on a stretch session on someday. As bad of a therapist as I am to say this, but yeah, I need to start getting into stretching maybe about 3 weeks ago. Crazy, but is what it is. Better late than never, sort of thing. Oh, this shoulder. Why are you giving up on me?
and stuff like that. Some people just can't stomach coconut.
The only time I like coconut is when it's on a cake, and I don't know what type of cake. It's like carrot cake or whatever.
Are you talking about like the coconut, like the southern coconut white cake thing, which is like covered in shredded coconut type stuff?
Even that's like I scrape off some of the coconut, like just because it's just too much.
That's fair.
But yeah, that would be the only time.
Not a coconut guy.
Well, I like them both.
Straight into the trash, but like the first ones into the trash.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer. I used to like the almond joy better because that's the milk chocolate. I prefer the dark chocolate one now, and I also like that it doesn't have the nuts on top of it because those hurt my teeth. I got bad teeth. Sometimes you're like, oh, I'll bite right around the nut, and then the nut's like, nah, I'm over there, and my teeth are like, help.
I had the same reaction in college.
to nuts.
Candy. All right.
Oh,
All right. Well, I was afraid that would go that way, but I like the dark
Sorry we
chocolate.
betrayed you.
I'm very hurt inside. No points for anyone.
all right, fair enough.
All right. Well, those were kind of chocolate bars, and we can circle back to chocolate bars. But there are different types of candy. And the next one I want to move on to is like sugar-based stuff.
Okay.
And this is, for me, in my experience, this is a thing I got so much of in my Halloween trick-or-treat bags. And that would be nerds.
Oh man.
You guys get a lot of nerds?
The little boxes, like
Yeah, those little cardboard boxes, and it's, for anyone who doesn't know, nerds are like little like BB-sized hunks that are basically just sugar.
Yeah.
But they come in boxes, so it's kind of like.
So reevaluating a lot of my
Huberman Lab
interests.
podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life. I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today we are going to talk all about dopamine and what drives you to do the things that you do. We're going to talk about motivation and desire and craving, but also how dopamine relates to satisfaction and our feelings of well-being. And of course, any discussion about dopamine has to include a discussion about the potential for dopamine-induced addiction. Indeed, dopamine lies at the heart of addiction to all things. But today we are mainly going to focus on how what we do and how we do it and how we conceptualize those things leads to changes in this amazing molecule in our brain and bodies that we call dopamine. I'm going to teach you what dopamine is and what it is not. There are a lot of myths about the molecule dopamine. We often hear about so-called dopamine hits. Today we are going to dispel many common myths about dopamine, and we are going to talk about how dopamine actually works. We're going to discuss the biology of dopamine, the psychology. We will discuss some neural circuits, and a really exciting aspect of dopamine biology are so-called dopamine schedules. In other words, we are going to discuss how things like food, drugs, caffeine, pornography, even some plant-based compounds can change our baseline levels of dopamine, and in doing so, they change how much dopamine we are capable of experiencing from what could be very satisfying events or events that make us feel not so good because of things that we did or took prior. I promise you it's going to be a vast discussion, but I will structure it for you, and you'll come away with a deep understanding of really what drives you. You will also come away with a lot of tools how to leverage dopamine so that you can sustain energy, drive, and motivation for the things that are important to you over long periods of time. I'm pleased to announce that the Huberman Lab podcast is now partnered with Momentous Supplements. We often talk about supplements on the Huberman Lab podcast, and while supplements aren't necessary for everybody, many people derive tremendous benefit from them for things like enhancing the quality and speed with which you get into sleep, or for enhancing focus, or for hormone support. And supplement, you can go to live, so you can check back there, literally underscores what dopamine in ways that serve us. This is, and underscores the fact that just through behaviors, no drugs, nothing of that sort, just through behaviors, we can achieve terrifically high increases in dopamine that are very long and sustained in ways that serve us. This is a result that was published in the European Journal of Physiology. I'll go into it in more detail later, but essentially what it involved is having human subjects get into water of different temperatures. It was warm water, moderately cool water, and cold water. Had them stay in that water for up to an hour, and they measured, by way of blood draw, things like cortisol, norepinephrine, and dopamine. What was fascinating is that cold water exposure led to very rapid increases in norepinephrine and epinephrine, which is also just called adrenaline.
I used to take cold showers.
It also led to increases
And unfortunately,
in
the scientists are like,
dopamine.
yeah.
And these increases in dopamine were
The
very
science behind
significant.
it.
They
should
kicked
keep
in
doing it.
around 10 or 15 minutes
Ugh.
after submersion into the cold
After a
water.
year and a
Now,
half
submersion
doing
head
it,
wasn't below water, it was just up
I
to
sort of
the
like,
neck.
I
And
don't know if it's helping or not. I
the
don't know for
dopamine
sure.
release
So I've
continued
stopped for about 2 or 3 months
to
now.
rise and rise and rise, and eventually
this guy's
reached
like, "No, keep doing it."
250% above
I'm like, "Damn it."
baseline. Now, what was interesting is
Why do you have to be an
after
expert in your
subjects
field
got
for?
out of this cold water, that dopamine increase was sustained. And I know nowadays many people are interested in using cold water therapy as a way to increase metabolism and fat loss, but also to improve sense of well-being, improve cognition, improve clarity of mind. There's something really special about this very alert but calm state of mind that seems to be the one that's optimal for pretty much everything except sleep. But for all aspects of work and for social engagement and for sport, that highly alert but calm state of mind really is the sweet spot that I believe most of us would like to achieve. And this cold water exposure, done correctly, really can help people achieve that state of mind through these increases in dopamine that last a very long time. So I will later detail the specifics of that study, what it entailed in terms of how long the variations that different subjects experienced, as well as how to limit the amount of stress hormone, cortisol, that's released as a consequence of the cold water. And we will also talk about compounds, supplements that people can take in order to increase their levels of dopamine, should they choose. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens is an all-in-one vitamin mineral probiotic drink. I've been taking Athletic Greens since 2012, so I'm delighted that they're sponsoring the podcast. The reason I still have episodes now on the so-called and the probiotics to support my microbiome of our brain and body health. Even if we're getting a lot of sunshine, many of us are still deficient in vitamin D3. And so brought to us by Inside Trackers. The reason is that many of the factors that impact our immediate and long-term health can only be discovered from a quality blood test. With most blood tests and DNA tests, however, you get information back, but
Some
not a
blood
lot of
tests when I do
information about
pull-ups
what
to
to do
increase
with
my
those
grip
numbers.
strength.
With Inside Tracker, they give
I
you
don't
a
just
lot
use
of
my
specific
full
recommendations as to lifestyle
grip
factors, nutrition factors,
do pull-ups.
supplementation factors, things you may
I
want to
hang
add
on my fingers
to your
instead.
life, or things you may want to
I
delete
do that as
from your
many
life
times
in
as I
order to
can
bring the numbers into the
before-
ranges that are best for your
If it
immediate
gets tight,
and
then I'll
long-term
use a
health.
full hand grip.
There's
But
simply
before
no
that,
replacement
I
for
do
these
finger
kinds of
grips
data.
only.
And your data are the
bit of
most
a rock
important
climbing
data
technique.
to you, and quality blood tests and DNA tests are the way to
Great,
access them.
great.
If you'd like to try Inside Tracker, go to insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off any of Inside Tracker's plans. That's insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off. Today's episode is also brought to us by Thesis. Thesis makes what are called nootropics, which means smart drugs. Now, to be honest, I am not a fan of the term nootropics. I don't believe in smart drugs in the sense that I don't believe that there's any one substance or collection of substances that can make us smarter. I do believe, based on science, however, that there are particular neural circuits and brain functions that allow us to be more focused, more alert, access creativity, be more motivated, etc. That's just the way that the brain works. Different neural circuits for different brain states. Thesis understands
So my
this.
fingers
And
gave
as
up.
far as I know,
at
they're the
6
first
reps.
nootropics company to create
Last four,
targeted
I'll do full-
nootropics for
full
specific
grip.
outcomes. I've been using
Pull-ups.
Thesis for more than 6 months now, and I can confidently say that their nootropics have been a total game changer. My go-to formula is the Clarity formula, or sometimes I'll use their Energy formula before training. To get your own personalized nootropic starter kit, go online to takethesis.com/Huberman, take a 3-minute quiz, and Thesis will send you 4 different formulas to try in your first month. That's takethesis.com/Huberman and use the code Huberman at checkout for 10% off your first order. I'd like to announce that there's an event that some of you may find very useful. This is an event put on by Logitech that I will be speaking at. It's called Rethink Education, the Biology of Learning, Reimagining Learning Through Neuroscience. And at this event, I will be speaking. There will be other speakers as well. And I will be talking about neuroplasticity and its applications for teaching and for learning. I will describe what I call the plasticity super protocol that incorporates all of what we know about rapid learning, efficient learning, and the best ways to teach and learn. It's geared towards educators of all kinds. It is zero cost, so please feel free to sign up. The event is September 30th, 2021 at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can find the registration link in the caption for this episode. So let's talk about dopamine. Most people have heard of dopamine, and we hear all the time now about dopamine hits. But actually, there's no such thing as a dopamine hit. And actually, the way that your body uses dopamine is to have a baseline level of dopamine, meaning an amount of dopamine that's circulating in your brain and body all the time. And that turns out to be important for how you feel generally, whether or not you're in a good mood, motivated, etc. And you also can experience peaks in dopamine above baseline. This has a very specific name in the neurobiology literature. So
10 kilo weights in the
tonic
backpack to
and
make it a bit
phasic
harder.
Release of dopamine. And I'll
Resistance bands
explain
around
what
the
that means
knees.
in a couple of minutes. But if you remember
Accentuate
nothing
more
else from this
toward the
episode,
glutes.
please remember this.
But also to make sure I'm
that when
contracting
you
on the way up and down
experience
in
something,
both
or you crave something
contractions.
really desirable, really exciting to you, very pleasurable, what happens afterwards is your baseline level of dopamine
Bands are very,
drops.
very functional in the sense
Okay,
that
so these
very
peaks in
multi-purpose.
dopamine, they influence how much
When we
dopamine will
prescribe
generally be circulating
bands to our
afterward. And you might think, oh, a big peak in
patients.
dopamine. After that, I'm going to feel even better
I mean,
because I just had this
when we
great
prescribe
event.
exercises,
Not the case.
it's always with
What
bands,
actually happens
because
is that your baseline
tied
level
against
of
something, you
dopamine
hold it against
drops.
yourself.
And I will explain the precise mechanism for that. Okay? In the neuroscience literature, we refer to this as tonic and phasic release of dopamine. Tonic being the low level baseline that's always there circulating, released into your brain all the time, and then phasic, these peaks that ride above that baseline. And those two things interact, and this is really important. I'm going to teach you the underlying neurobiology, but even if you have no background in biology, I promise to make it all clear. I'll explain the terms and what they mean. And I'm excited to teach you about dopamine because dopamine has everything to do with how you feel right now as you're listening to this. It has everything to do with how you will feel an hour from now. It has everything to do with your level of motivation and your level of desire and your willingness to push through effort. If ever you've interacted with somebody who just doesn't seem to have any drive, they've given up, or if you've interacted with somebody who seems to have endless drive and energy, what you are looking at there in those two circumstances is without question a difference in the level of dopamine circulating in their system. There will be other factors too, but the level of dopamine is the primary
I think
determinant
sub 120 beats, we'll
of
get into the
how
next set.
motivated we are, how excited we are, how outward facing we are, and how willing we are to lean into life and pursue things. Dopamine is what we call a neuromodulator. Neuromodulators are different than neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are involved in the dialogue between neurons, nerve cells, and neurotransmitters tend to mediate local communication. Just imagine two people talking to one another at a concert. That communication between them is analogous to the communication carried out by neurotransmitters, whereas neuromodulators influence the communication of many neurons. Imagine.
Hey Jimmy, am I fighting demons? Ah, that'd be interesting. You remind me of Demon Slayer, but no, not fighting demons. Just training for life, that's all. Life hits harder than demons, don't worry. How are you, Jimmy? Still planking? I'm pretty sure you're the one that was planking last time. Yeah, I'm just listening to stuff in the background. What do my mic picks up and everything?
A bunch of people dancing where it's a coordinated dance involving 10 or 20 or hundreds of people. Neuromodulators are coordinating that dance. In the nervous system, what this means is that dopamine release changes the probability that certain neural circuits will be active and that other neural circuits will be inactive. Okay? So it modulates a bunch of things all at once. And that's why it's so powerful. It's shifting not just our levels of energy, but also our mindset, also our feelings of whether or not we can or cannot accomplish something. How does dopamine work and what does it do? Well, first of all, it is not just responsible.
Solid, Jimmy. Squats, amazing compound movement exercises. You do it body weight or weighted, or resistance bands like me. How do you perform your squats? Wonderful lower body exercise. How do I say? Keep your feet about shoulder width apart. Go wide if you need to. Squat's a squat. There is form to it. Like everyone would like to be straight down the middle. I started off wide because that's just the range of motion I had to begin with. Something's better than nothing sort of thing. But once my flexibility increased, then my feet could get more narrow. I could squat more down close towards my heels. Nice, Jimmy. Nice. Good to keep it mixed up. Keep the body guessing. Don't let yourself plateau. Wonderful. Wait, wonderful. Why is it saying I'm on this stream for some reason? Anyway. And now I've lost my train of thought. Yeah. Something wrong with my stream. But whatever. Good to know, man. Good to know. Oh, now I'm annoyed. I had something to tell you about this and now it just jumped out of my head. I'll probably remember it once I get off stream. But anyway, yeah. Good work, man. Good work. No, yeah, like I said before, just adding if you didn't hear, if you add resistance bands, it makes sure that you're working your legs on the way down because it's contracted, and then on the way up, that's always the push part. That part's from your weight, but on the way down, you can add some resistance from the bands.
For pleasure, it is responsible for motivation and drive, primarily at the psychological level. Also for craving. Those three things are sort of the same: motivation, drive, and craving. It also controls time perception. We will get deep into how dopamine can modulate time perception and how important it is that everybody be able to access increases in dopamine at different time scales. This turns out to be important to not end up addicted to substances, but
Originally, I'm mostly body weight. There was a good 2 years of gym that I had where I used a lot of weights. But since working at home and not having the full gym equipment, you got to get a bit creative. Or change how you do those sets. Oh. So without those weights, I've got the 10 kilo backpack, resistance bands, high reps. Makes up for it.
But it also turns out to be very important to sustain effort and be a happy person over long periods of time, which I think most everybody wants. It certainly is adaptive in life to be able to do that. Dopamine is also vitally important for movement. I'll explain the neural circuits for dopamine and mindset and dopamine and movement in a moment, but in diseases like Parkinson's or Lewy body's dementia, which is similar to Parkinson's in many ways, there's a depletion or death of dopamine neurons at a particular location in the brain, which leads to shaky movements, challenges in speaking, challenges in particular in initiating movement, and because dopamine is depleted elsewhere too, people with Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia also experience drops in motivation and affect, meaning mood. They tend to get depressed and so on. When those people are properly treated, they can, not always, but they can recover some fluidity of movement, some ability to initiate movement, and almost without question, those people feel better psychologically, not just because they can move, but also because dopamine impacts mood and motivation. So what are the underlying neural circuits? For those of you that are not interested in biology and specific nomenclature, you can tune out now if you want, but it's actually pretty straightforward. You have two main neural circuits in the brain that dopamine uses in order to exert all its effects. The The first one
Another thing.
is a pathway that
We're doing
goes from
squats.
this area
If
in
unweighted.
what's called the ventral tegmentum.
The reason why
It's
people do
fancy, but
this
ventral just means bottom, and
or
tegmentum
this,
actually means floor.
why
So
it
it's
helps,
at the bottom of the brain, and it's
because when
the
you're going
ventral
down,
part of the floor, so it's really low.
you don't want to be
in the
squatting
back of the brain, the
forward.
ventral tegmentum,
Sort of, you're
and
thinking
it
your
goes
squat now.
from
So
the
to get your
ventral
back straight,
tegmentum
you do this.
to what's called the
To keep this
ventral
part
striatum
upright.
and the prefrontal cortex.
I find this
Now,
one
that's
to
a
be
lot of
better.
language, but basically what we call
up
this
higher
is the
compared to this. My arms are down
mesocortical
here
pathway.
compared
This
to this,
is the pathway
where it's out straight.
by which dopamine
So the higher this arm
influences
goes, the more
motivation,
your upper back
drive,
stays
and
straight.
craving. It involves structures that some
so
of
you
you
don't
may have
wanna do
heard of
this.
before, things like
you
nucleus
wanna do
accumbens and the
this.
prefrontal
So I'm
cortex.
straight
This is
forward.
the pathway that really gets disrupted in
Oh.
addictions, where in particular drugs that influence the release of dopamine,
158.
like cocaine and methamphetamine, we'll talk about those
I'll
drugs
start the
today,
next set at
they
sub
tap into this
120
pathway.
beats.
But if you are pursuing a partner, a boyfriend or girlfriend, if you're pursuing a degree in school, if you're pursuing a finish line in a race, you are tapping into this so-called mesocorticolimbic pathway. This is the classic reward pathway in all mammals. The other pathway emerges from an area in the brain called the substantia nigra, so called because the cells in that
If
area
anyone's
are
interested,
dark,
I'm listening to Alex.
and the substantia nigra
Andrew Huberman
connects
Labs.
to an area of the brain called
He's a
the dorsal
neuroscientist,
striatum.
but he loves
This is,
exercise at the
not
same time.
surprisingly, called the
So-
nigrostriatal pathway. For the
He teaches about my software to my hardware, if you get what I'm saying.
those of you who have never done any neuroanatomy, I'm going to teach you a little trick right now. Everything in neuroanatomy, the first part of a word tells you where the neurons are. And then the second part tells you where they are connecting to. So when I say nigrostriatal pathway, it means that the neurons
black
are in
part.
the substantia nigra and they connect to the striatum, nigrostriatal pathway. So while it's a lot of language, there is some
Nigra
logic
actually means
there.
black,
Okay.
and there is a black
So we've got
part
these two
inside our brain
pathways, one
called
mainly
the
for
substantia
movement,
nigra.
right? This is the substantia nigra to
And
dorsal
specifically in
striatum.
that part of our brain, it
And
is darker than the
We've
other
got
parts.
this other pathway, the so-called mesocortical limbic pathway, that's for reward, reinforcement, and motivation. I want you to remember that there are two pathways. If you don't remember the two pathways in detail, that's fine. But please remember that there are two pathways because that turns out to be important later. Now, the other thing to understand about dopamine is that the way that
This is
dopamine
sub 130
is
beats. This is taking
released
too
in
long.
the brain and body can differ.
Every time I get up, my heart
Meaning
rate goes
it can
up
be
again.
very local or it can be more broad. Now, most of you have probably heard of synapses. Synapses are the little spaces between neurons, and basically neurons, nerve cells, communicate with one another by making each other electrically active or by making each other less electrically active. So here's how this works. You can imagine one nerve cell and another nerve cell with a little gap between them, a little synapse. And the way that one nerve cell causes the next nerve cell to fire, what we call fire really means to become electrically active, is that it vomits out these little packets, what we call vesicles. They're little bubbles filled with a chemical. When that chemical enters the synapse, some of it docks or parks on the other side in the other neuron, and by virtue of electrical changes in the what we call the postsynaptic neuron, that chemical will make that neuron more electrically active or less electrically active. Dopamine can do that like any other neurotransmitter or neuromodulator. So it can have one neuron influence another neuron, but dopamine can also engage in what's called volumetric release. Volumetric release is like a giant vomit that gets out to 50 or 100 or even thousands of cells. So there's local release, what we call synaptic release, and then there's volumetric release. So volumetric release is like dumping all this dopamine out into the system. So dopamine is incredible because it can change the way that our neural circuits work at a local scale and at a very broad scale. And for those of you that are only interested in tools, like how do I get more dopamine?
Makes sense. Yeah.
Let me tell
Yeah.
you, this part
I
is
mean,
really important because
For the longest
if
time,
you
I just
were to
assumed.
take a drug
Oh yeah,
or
because I'm moving
supplement
my arms.
that increases your
That's
level
why
of dopamine,
I'm getting a
you
better
are
rep.
influencing both
But-
the local release of
Nah.
dopamine
You're
and
just straightening your back
volumetric
out to make it
release.
easier, less restricted
This
up top.
relates back to the baseline of dopamine and the big peak above baseline. And that turns out to be important. And I'll just allude to why it's important. Many drugs, and indeed many supplements that increase dopamine, will actually make it harder for you to sustain dopamine release over long periods of time and to achieve those peaks that most of us are craving when we are in pursuit of things. Why? Because if you get both volumetric release, the dumping out of dopamine everywhere, and you're getting local release, what it means is that the difference between the peak and baseline is likely to be small. And this is very important, how satisfying or exciting or pleasurable a given experience is doesn't just depend on the height of that peak. It depends on the height of that peak relative to the baseline. So if you increase the baseline and you increase the peak, you're not going to achieve more and more pleasure from things. I'll talk about how to leverage this information in a little bit.
170 beats.
Just
Jesus.
increasing your dopamine, yes, it will make you excited for all things.
Stop
It will
130,
make
I'll
you
get to
feel
the last
very
rep,
motivated, but
last
it will
set.
also make that motivation very short-lived.
We'll start the second half of
So
the exercises.
there's a better way to increase your dopamine. There's a better way to optimize this peak to baseline ratio. For now, what we've talked about is two main neural circuits, one for movement and one for motivation and craving with dopamine. And we've talked about two main modes of communication between neurons with dopamine. One is this local synaptic release. One is more volumetric release. And in the back of your mind, you can relate this back to, again, this baseline versus peaks above baseline. So that's a description of what we would call the spatial effects or the
When I see what my
spatial
heart rate gets up
aspects
to, I'm like,
of
oh, man.
dopamine. I said this
Hope
connects to
that's
that,
normal.
that connects to this. You can
But
get local or
I don't know
more
why.
broad volumetric
I've
release.
always, no matter
What
how much
about the
I've worked out for over
duration
20
of
years,
release, or the duration
or
of
getting to
action
20,
for
I'd say.
dopamine? Well,
And-
dopamine is unique among chemicals in the brain.
normally a scale for fitness parameters, I guess, whatever, is heart rate. It's very normal for you, once you get more fitter, your body gets more efficient, to have a lower resting heart rate. I don't know what my resting heart rate is, but it doesn't get up there though once I start pushing myself. 170 beats per minute. That's almost 3 beats a second. Jeez. Ah. So maybe I'm healthy in that department where I'm able to sustain, I guess, that heart rate without, I don't know, dropping to the ground. Where are we? 135. 5 more beats.
Because
Start the
dopamine,
last set.
unlike a lot of chemicals in the brain, works through what are called G-protein coupled receptors. And for those of you that are about to pass out from the amount of detail, just hang in there with me. It's really not complicated. There are 2 ways that neurons can communicate, or mainly 2 ways. There are a third and a fourth, but mostly neurons communicate by 2 modes. One are what we call fast electrical synapses, ionotropic conduction.
That's right. I'll just
You
start
don't need to know what
the
that
next
means, but basically one neuron activates another neuron and little holes open up in that neuron and ions rush in. Sodium is the main ion, salt, by which one neuron influences the electrical activity of another neuron, because sodium
So I got the
ions
message I need to
contain
get to work by
charge.
11.
Okay, there are other things like
That gives me
chloride
30
and
minutes to
potassium.
finish up this
you
workout,
shouldn't
which is
look
good
things up,
timing.
Just look up ionic conductances in the action potential, or I could do a post on it sometime and we could go into detail, but just understand that when neurons want to influence each other, they can do it by way of this fast ionotropic conduction. This is a really quick way for one neuron to influence the next. Dopamine doesn't communicate that way. Dopamine is slower. It works through what are called G-protein coupled receptors. So what happens is dopamine is released in these little vesicles
I got
that I
30
mentioned
minutes.
before, get vomited out into the synapse. Some of that dopamine will bind to the so-called postsynaptic neuron. It'll bind to the next neuron, and then it sets off a cascade. It's kind of like a bucket brigade of one thing getting handed off to the next, to the next, to the next. It's G-protein coupled receptors. And anytime you hear about these GPCRs or G-protein coupled receptors, pay attention because they're really interesting. They're slow, but they also can have multiple cascades of effects. They can impact even gene expression at some level. They can
Next second
change
half
what a
is gonna be
cell
Russian
actually
twists.
becomes. They can
And I'll
change
think
how
about the 4th exercise later.
well or how poorly
As long
that
as I
cell
get through
will
that first.
respond to the same signal in the future. So dopamine works through this slower process, these G-protein coupled receptors. And so its effects tend to take a while in order to occur. This aspect
The
of
fact that I'm failing through my
dopamine
sets, it means I'm
transmission is
getting to that
important
part
because it now underscores 2
where
things.
I'm making
One,
more proper
there's
gains.
2 pathways for
If you can
dopamine
get
to
through a
communicate,
set
one for movement, one for motivation
without a
and
problem,
craving. There's 2
then your body
spatial
was already
scales at
capable.
which dopamine can
It's once you get to that
operate
difficult part.
synaptically or volumetrically, and dopamine
Yeah.
can have slow effects really slow
That's where your
effects,
body's
or
really
even
pushing
very
itself.
long-lasting effects, and it even can control gene expression. It can actually change the way that cells
It's like
behave.
that
One thing
Muhammad
that's
Ali
not often
quote.
discussed about dopamine,
Something along
but
the
is
lines of, I don't
extremely
start
important
counting
to
reps
know,
until it starts hurting.
is that dopamine doesn't
Something like
work
that.
on its own. Neurons that release dopamine co-release glutamate. Glutamate is a neurotransmitter, and it's a neurotransmitter that is excitatory, meaning it stimulates neurons to be electrically active. So now, even if you don't know any cell biology, you should start to gain a picture that dopamine is responsible for movement, motivation, and drive. It does that through two pathways, but also that dopamine stimulates action in general because it releases this
Cheers,
excitatory
Sleepy.
neurotransmitter. It tends
I'll
to
try,
make certain
I'll
neurons
try to do it by the end of the
that are
stream, but
nearby, or even
you
that are
caught me
far
at a
away because of volumetric
limited
release, it tends
time
to make those more
to
active.
be able to do
So
this.
dopamine is really
But
stimulating.
thank you.
And indeed, we say that dopaminergic transmission, or dopamine, tends to stimulate sympathetic arousal. Sympathetic doesn't have anything to do with sympathy. It just simply means that it tends to increase our levels of alertness. It tends to bring an animal or a human into a state of more alertness, readiness, and desire to pursue things
I
outside
don't
the
feel like you
confines
chose
of
to
its
do that
skin.
then.
So if I were to just put a really simple message around dopamine, it would be there's a molecule in your brain and body that, when released, tends to make you look outside yourself, pursue things outside yourself, and to crave things outside yourself. The pleasure that arrives from achieving things also involves dopamine, but is mainly the consequence of other molecules. But if ever you felt lethargic and just lazy and you had no motivation or drive, that's a low dopamine state. If ever you felt really excited, motivated, even if you were a little scared to do something, maybe you did your first skydive, or you're about to do your first skydive, or you're about to do some public speaking and you really don't want to screw it up, you are in a high dopamine state. Dopamine is a universal currency in all mammals,
6
but
sets,
especially in
done.
humans, for moving us toward goals, and how much dopamine is in our system at any one time compared to how much
I'm
dopamine was in
lazy,
our system a
so
few minutes ago,
I'm going to do Russian
and
twists.
how much we remember
With the pull-up bar,
enjoying a particular
but not
experience
weighted
of the
this time.
past.
I'm already starting to fail
That
the weighted time.
dictates your so-called quality of life and your desire to pursue things.
I should be up to the
This is
part
really
where
important. Dopamine
Oh, no,
is
without
a
weights.
currency, and it's the
Should
way
give me
that
enough
you
resistance.
track pleasure. It's the way that you track success. It's the way that you track whether or not you are doing well or doing poorly. And that is subjective. But if your dopamine is too low, you will not feel motivated. If your dopamine is really high, you will feel motivated. And if your dopamine is somewhere in the middle, how you feel depends on whether or not you had higher dopamine a few minutes ago or lower dopamine.
let's go sub
This is
130 beats for the next set.
Your experience of life and your level of motivation and drive depends on
Goddamn you, Sleepy.
how much dopamine you have relative to your recent experience. This is, again, something that's just not accounted for in the simple language of dopamine hits. Okay? A simple way to envision dopamine hits is every time you do something you like, you eat a piece of chocolate, dopamine hit. You look at your Instagram, dopamine hit. You see someone you like, dopamine hit. You know, all these things described as dopamine hits neglect the fact that if you scroll social media and you see something you really like, dopamine hit. Sure, there's an increase in dopamine.
You guys sleepy?
But then you get to something else
20
and you
20
go,
push-ups.
not that interesting. However, had you arrived at that second thing first, you might think that it was
It'll
really
last.
interesting.
But
If you had
for
arrived
the
to that
exercises.
second Instagram post
Making sure I put in
3
a
days
sweat.
later or 4 days later, you might find it extremely interesting. Again, how much dopamine you experience from something depends on your baseline level of dopamine when you arrive there and your previous dopamine peaks. Okay? That's super important to understand, and it's completely neglected by the general language of dopamine hits. This is why, when you repeatedly engage in something that you enjoy, your threshold for enjoyment goes up and up and up.
if you want simple trick advice when it comes to, I'll just say, increasing your cardio, very broad term, is learn how to breathe through your nose, in and out. It'll make any exercise you do harder if you're not used to it yet, but you can train it like anything, like most things in our body. But essentially, when you do your workout, start just with nose breathing. Once it gets hard, then use your mouth. But every time you do it, you condition yourself, you get better and better. Scientifically, it is better to breathe through your nose, your little nose hairs. It acts like a humidifier, so the air that you breathe in is warmed up, takes out some of the contaminants that might be in the air, and it lets your body, that gas exchange process in your lungs, it goes a bit more smoother compared to if you breathe through your mouth. It does the same thing, but a little less quality, that's all. So nose breathing is a nice thing to get into. I got into it I'd say relatively young, high school and whatnot. I just learned how to nose breathe, and it's just natural to me now to breathe through my nose. But yeah, no. Once you get tired, that old habit of mouth breathing comes back very quickly because your body's just trying to. It wants that gas exchange, breathe quick as it can, take up the carbon dioxide, bring in the oxygen, get that energy back in, take up the waste. It's a very efficient process, but if you get your breathing down pat, it helps everything. Breathing, the importance of breathing, people just don't understand. It's something we do every day, so we take it for granted. But if you fix something like that, you change your body's chemistry in seconds, minutes. Helps your input and output, but it also helps your health. What else? Also, it stimulates one of our nervous systems where it helps you relax, calm down, take it a bit more easy. Deep breathing, that is. You sort of stimulate one of your nerves, and then deep breathing. Again, it's something, I get it, everyone does it, but not everyone trains to do it though. And people don't realize how much not doing it properly, especially if you're, I just keep going, sorry. Like if you're at desk work, you're sitting down, you're hunched over like that, you're closed in. It's pretty hard to breathe like this. And everyone has different spectrums or degrees of how much they sit like this, but the more you sit up, the more you bring your chest back, everything opens. My lungs can expand, I can take in that oxygen, I can bring in that exchange much more easier and more efficient. But yeah, anyway, rant over. But if you're always happy to explain more if people wanna learn. Like breathing was what I wanted to specialize in, but it's a lot more complicated than what I expected.
So I want to talk about that process, and I want to explain how that process works, because if you understand that process and you understand some of these schedules and kinetics, as we call them, around dopamine, you will be in a terrific position to use any dopamine enhancing tools that you decide to use. You'll be in an excellent position to modulate and control your own dopamine release for optimal motivation and drive. I realized that was a lot of information about the biology of dopamine, sort of like trying to make you drink from the fire hose of dopamine biology. However, I realize that some people probably want even more information about the biology of dopamine transmission. If you're interested in that, I'll post a link to an absolutely stellar review that was published in Nature Reviews Neuroscience called Spatial and Temporal Scales of Dopamine Transmission. It is quite detailed, but they have beautiful diagrams and can walk you through all the things that I just described and get into even more detail. We'll put a link to that in the caption on YouTube. Right now, I want to share with you two anecdotes, one from my own life and one from some fairly recent
Russian
history that illustrate some of the core biology of dopamine and how profoundly it can shape our experience.
How far I came
The first one is a really tragic situation that occurred. This was in the 80s. There was a outbreak of what looked like Parkinsonian symptoms in a young population. So many of you have heard of Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a disease in which people initially start to quake, can't generate smooth movements. They'll have issues with speech, sometimes cognition as well. There are examples like Michael J. Fox, which are early onset Parkinson's. Typically, it hits people a little bit later in life. There's a genetic component. But there is this question, and there's always been this question, whether or not certain lifestyle factors can also create Parkinson's. And some years ago, there was a situation where street laboratories, illicit laboratories, were trying to make a drug called MPPP, which is an opioid-like compound. It's a bit like heroin. And heroin addicts seeking heroin went out and bought what they thought was MPPP. Unfortunately, it was not MPPP. And it would have been tragic if it was anyway, because they were drug addicts. But what they ended up taking turned out to be a lot worse. What they ended up taking was MPTP, and MPTP can arise in the synthesis of MPPP. So someone in a lab someplace, this was mainly in the Central Valley in California, but elsewhere as well, somebody created MPTP, and what ended up happening was a large number of young people who were opioid addicts became completely boxed in, paralyzed. Couldn't speak, couldn't blink, couldn't do anything, couldn't function, couldn't move. So both aspects of dopamine transmission were disrupted. They had no motivation and drive. They couldn't generate any movement of any kind. They were literally locked in, frozen. And sadly, this is
Starting to feel a bit
irreversible.
sick.
It's irreversible
That's when you
because
know you're
what
pushing yourself a little bit.
MPTP does is it kills
But I can't
the
go too far, 'cause it'll
dopaminergic
work.
neurons of the substantia nigra, that nigrostriatal pathway that's involved in generating movement, and it kills the dopaminergic neurons of the so-called mesocortical limbic pathway. I was in college when this whole MPTP thing happened, and I remember hearing this story. At the time, I had no understanding of what it is to have very high levels of dopamine or extremely depleted levels of dopamine. There was no reason why I should have that understanding. I mean, of course, I had experienced different pleasures of different kinds, and I've had lows in my life, but nothing to the extreme that I'm about to discuss. I got Giardia, and Giardia is a stomach bug that, if any of you ever had it, it is terrible. It's terrible diarrhea. You end up very dehydrated very quickly. You drop a ton of weight, and it is extremely unpleasant. I ended up going to the emergency room, and in the emergency room, I begged them for something to stop up my guts, and they gave it to me. They put a saline line in to rehydrate me, and they injected something into the saline bag, and within minutes, I felt more sadness, more overwhelming sense of depression, basically lower than I'd ever felt in my entire life. It was absolutely profound. I was crying endlessly without knowing why I was crying. I was miserable. And I asked them, what did you inject? And they said, we injected Thorazine. Thorazine is an antipsychotic drug. It's actually used to block dopamine receptors. It's what's given to people who have schizophrenia. Often it's given to people who have schizophrenia because schizophrenia involves, among other things, elevated levels of dopamine. It was horrible. The experience of it was miserable, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And so I actually said to them, what did you give me? They said Thorazine. And I said, you have to give me L-Dopa. You have to give me something to get my dopamine levels back up again. And they did. They gave me an injection of L-Dopa into the bag, went straight into my bloodstream, and within minutes, I felt fine again. It was incredible, and it really opened up my mind and my experience to what it is to have absolutely plummeted levels of dopamine. There's nothing more miserable than that, I'll tell you. And these poor souls who had this MPTP experience, unfortunately, they couldn't recover those cells. People who have severe Parkinson's are struggling with this as well, because in Parkinson's and in Lewy body dementia, the dopaminergic neurons often die. It's not just a problem with those neurons releasing enough dopamine. Later, we're going to talk about some approaches to maintaining dopaminergic neuron health and things that we can all do for that. But I will tell you, these dopamine neurons that we all have are very precious for movement and mood and motivation. Having experienced what it is to have very, very low levels of dopamine, or to, in this case, to have my dopamine receptors blocked from Thorazine, was eye-opening, to say the least, and has given me tremendous sensitivity to the fact that dopamine is perhaps one of the most powerful molecules that any of us has inside of us, and the one that we ought to all think very carefully about how we leverage. Because while most experiences and most things that we do and take and eat and etc. won't create enormous highs and enormous lows in dopamine, even subtle fluctuations in dopamine really shape our perception of life and what we're capable of and how we feel. And so we want to guard those, and we want to understand them. So let's lean into that understanding about dopamine, and then let's talk about some tools that we can all use to leverage dopamine in order to keep that baseline in the appropriate healthy place and still be able to access those peaks in dopamine, because those, after all, are some of what makes life rich and worth living. So let's talk about the baseline of dopamine that we all have and the peaks in dopamine that we all can achieve through different activities and things that we ingest. All of us have different baseline levels of dopamine. Some of this is sure to be genetic. Some people just simply ride at a level a little bit higher, a little bit more excited. They're a little bit more motivated. Or maybe they're a lot more excited or a lot more motivated. Some people are a little mellower. Some people are a little less excitable. And some of that has to do with the fact that dopamine doesn't act alone. Dopamine has close cousins or friends in the nervous system, and I'll just name off a few of those close cousins and friends. Epinephrine, also called adrenaline, is the main chemical driver of energy. We can't do anything at all, unless we have some level of epinephrine in our brain and body. It's released from the adrenal glands, which are right atop our kidneys. It's released from an area of the brainstem called locus ceruleus. And its release tends to wake up neural circuits in the brain and wake up various aspects of our body's physiology and give us a readiness. So it should come as no surprise that dopamine and epinephrine, aka adrenaline, hang out together. In fact, epinephrine and adrenaline are actually manufactured from dopamine. There's a biochemical pathway involving dopamine. Just a beautiful pathway. If ever you want to look it up, you could just look up biochemistry of dopamine. What you'll find is that L-dopa is converted into dopamine. Dopamine is converted into noradrenaline, norepinephrine, it's also called, and norepinephrine is converted into adrenaline. So not only are dopamine and epinephrine, aka adrenaline, close cousins, they are actually family members. Okay, they're closely related. I'm not going to get too deep into epinephrine today. I'm not going to talk too much about those pathways. But anytime I'm talking about dopaminergic transmission or that you have a peak in dopamine, inevitably that means that you have a peak in release of epinephrine as well. What dopamine does is dopamine really colors the subjective experience of an activity to make it more pleasurable, to make it something that you want more of. Epinephrine is more about energy. Epinephrine alone can be fear, paralysis, trauma, not physical paralysis, but mental paralysis, frozen in fear or being traumatized or scared. With the addition of dopamine to that chemical cocktail, if dopamine is released in the brain, well then that epinephrine becomes one of excitement. Okay, I'm using a broad brush here, but essentially what you need to know is that dopamine and epinephrine, aka adrenaline, are family members, and they tend to work together like a little gang to make you seek out certain things. So what sorts of activities, what sorts of things increase dopamine? And how much do they increase dopamine? Well, let's take a look at some typical things that people do out there or ingest out there that are known to increase dopamine. So let's recall that you have a baseline level of dopamine and that everybody does. And even within a family, you might have family members who are very excitable, happy, and motivated, and others who are less excitable, happy, and motivated.
I'm going to try to do 3 more sets.
Your level of
about
dopamine
15, 20 minutes. I'll see
has
if I can
everything
get there.
to do with those genetics, but also with what you've
what's
experienced
what?
in the previous days and the previous
Priorities.
months and so on.
I'll start the next set in about sub 130
When
beats.
you do or ingest certain things, your levels of dopamine will
Just cut it real
rise
quick.
above baseline transiently. And depending on what you do or ingest, it will rise either more or less, and it will be very brief or it'll last a long time. So let's take a look at some of the typical things that people take and do and eat. Some are good for us, some are not good for us. And let's ask how much dopamine is increased above baseline.
All right,
Now, of
sub
course, these are
130.
averages, but these are averages that have been measured in so-called microdialysis studies in animals, so actually extracting from particular brain areas how much dopamine is released, or from measuring the serum, the circulating levels of dopamine in humans. Chocolate. They didn't look at milk versus dark chocolate, but chocolate will increase your baseline level of dopamine 1.5 times. Okay? So it's a pretty substantial increase in dopamine. It's transient. It goes away after a few minutes or even a few seconds. I'll explain what determines the duration in a minute. But 1.5 times for chocolate. Sex, both the pursuit of sex and the act of sex, increases dopamine 2 times. So it's a doubling above baseline.
Almost as good as
Now,
chocolate.
of course, there's going to be variation there, but that's the average increase in baseline dopamine caused by sex. Later, I will talk about how the different aspects of the so-called arousal arc, the different aspects of sex, believe it or not, have a differential impact on dopamine. But for now, as a general theme or activity, sex doubles the amount of dopamine circulating in your blood.
My forearm's giving
Nicotine.
out.
In particular, nicotine that is smoked, cigarettes and so forth, increases dopamine 2.5 times above baseline. So there's
Is
a
that why all my
peak
friends are smokers?
that goes up above baseline 2.5 times higher. It is very short-lived. Anyone who's ever been a chain smoker or observed a chain smoker understands that the increase in dopamine from nicotine is very short-lived. Cocaine will increase the level of dopamine in the bloodstream 2.5 times above baseline. And amphetamine, another drug that increases dopamine, will increase the amount of dopamine in the bloodstream 10 times above baseline. A tremendous increase in dopamine. Exercise. Now, exercise will have a different impact on the levels of dopamine depending on how much somebody subjectively enjoys that exercise. For someone who loves running, chances are it's going to increase your levels of dopamine 2 times above your baseline, not unlike sex. People who dislike exercise will achieve less dopamine increase or no increase in dopamine from exercise. And if you like other forms of exercise like yoga or weightlifting or swimming or what have you, again, it's going to vary by your subjective experience of whether or not you enjoy that activity. This is important, and it brings us back to something that we talked about.
Personally, I didn't see the benefits of exercise until definitely after a while. It wasn't until you turn into a habit. I don't know if I can call it exercise anymore, just a daily routine. But lost my train of thought again. Keep listening to this guy. He seems to know what he's talking about.
Earlier. Remember that
6 more beats.
mesocorticolimbic pathway? Well, the cortical part is important. The cortical part actually has a very specific part, which is your prefrontal cortex, the area of your forebrain that's involved in thinking and planning and involved in assigning a rational explanation to something and involved in assigning a subjective experience to something. Right? So for instance, the pen that I'm holding right now, it's one of these Pilot V5s. I love these Pilot V5s. They don't sponsor the podcast. I just happen to like them. I like the way that they write, how they feel. If I spent enough time thinking about it or talking about it, I could probably get a dopamine increase just talking about this Pilot V5. And that's not because I have the propensity to release dopamine easily. It's that as we start to engage with something more and more, and what we say about it and what we encourage ourselves to think about it has a profound impact on its rewarding or non-rewarding properties. Now, it's not simply the case that you can lie to yourself and you can tell yourself, I love something, and when you don't really love it, and it will increase dopamine. But what's been found over and over again is that if people journal about something or they practice some form of appreciation for something or they think of some aspect of something that they enjoy, the amount of dopamine that that behavior will evoke tends to go up. So for people that hate exercise, you can think about some aspect of exercise that you really enjoy. However, I will caution you against
3 happy moments.
saying to yourself,
It tends to be a
I
pretty good
hate
practice.
exercise, or I hate studying, or I hate this person, but I love the reward I give myself afterward.
Yeah.
Later, we're going to talk about how rewards given afterward
Like
actually
any habit, it's
make the
hard
situation
to
worse.
stick to.
They won't make you
follow it.
like exercise more or
But it is
study
one
more.
of those
They
habits that
actually
tends
will
to have good
undermine
rewards.
the dopamine release that would
I
otherwise
used
occur
it during a
for
time
that
of
activity.
grief in my life when
So,
I lost a friend, and I
certain
found it to be
things,
very handy.
chemicals, have a
It's an advice that I give a lot
universal
of people
effect.
who are
They make
grieving.
everybody's dopamine go
To write a
up.
diary, as if
So
you're having
some
a
people like
conversation with the
chocolate,
person who
some
passed
people
away.
don't, of course. But in general, it causes this increase in dopamine. But
Self-reflection
sex,
is very,
nicotine,
very handy.
cocaine, amphetamine, those
You're at
things
least
cause increases in dopamine in everybody that
bringing
takes them.
you're physically manifesting
Things
your
like
emotions
exercise,
onto
studying,
something.
hard work, working through
which
a
I find
challenge
very
in a
handy.
relationship, or working
It's
through
not the
something
same as
hard
just
of any
thinking
kind.
about it and being like,
That
oh,
is
yeah,
going to be subjective
I know what
as
I'm
to
feeling.
how much dopamine will
I've
be
addressed
released.
what's
And we will
happened,
return to that subjective
but
component
writing it out
in a little bit.
is just
And now
a
you have a
different
sense
form of expression.
of
That's all.
how much
All right, I wasted
dopamine can
enough
be
time.
evoked by different activities and by different substances. One that you might be wondering about is caffeine. I'm certainly drinking my caffeine today, and I do enjoy caffeine in limited quantities. I drink yerba mate and I drink coffee, and I love it. Does it increase dopamine? Well, a little bit. Caffeine will increase dopamine to some extent, but it is pretty modest compared to the other things that I described: chocolate, sex, nicotine, cocaine, amphetamine, and so on. However, there's a really interesting paper published in 2015. This is Volkow et al. You can look it up, it's very easy to find. That showed that regular ingestion of caffeine, whether or not it's from coffee or otherwise, increases upregulation of certain dopamine receptors. So caffeine actually makes you able to experience more of dopamine's effects. Because as I mentioned before, dopamine is vomited out into the synapse or it's released volumetrically, but then it has to bind someplace and trigger those G protein coupled receptors. And caffeine increases the number, the density of those G protein coupled receptors. Now, sitting back and thinking about that, you might think, oh yeah, sometimes I'll notice people, at least in the old days, that it used to be a cigarette and a cup of coffee. Or when people drink alcohol, oftentimes they'll smoke. And it's well known that different compounds like alcohol and nicotine, or caffeine and nicotine, or certain behaviors and certain drugs can synergize to give bigger dopamine increases. And this is not terribly uncommon. There are a lot of people nowadays who, for instance, take pre-workout energy drinks. They'll drink I won't name names, but they'll drink a canned energy drink, or they'll drink a pre-workout, and they'll try and get that big stimulation, that stimulant effect for the dopamine, the norepinephrine, that family of molecules that works together to make you motivated. And then they'll also exercise to try and get even more of a dopaminergic experience out of that workout. Sometimes it's also to perform better as well, of course. But as we'll talk about in a few minutes, that aspect, or that approach rather, of trying to just get your dopamine as high as you possibly can in order to get the most out of an experience, turns out to not be the best approach. And what you'll find as we talk about dopamine schedules is that layering together multiple things, substances, and activities that lead to big increases in dopamine actually can create pretty severe issues with motivation and energy right after those experiences, and even a couple days later. So I'm not saying that people shouldn't take the occasional pre-workout if that's your thing, or drink a cup of coffee or two before working out now and again. Some people really enjoy that. I certainly do that every once in a while. But if you do it too often, what you'll find is that your capacity to release dopamine and your level of motivation and drive and energy overall will take a serious hit. Now, I've been alluding to this dopamine peaks versus dopamine baseline thing since the beginning of the episode. Talked about tonic and phasic release and so forth. But now let's really drill into what this means and how to leverage it for our own purposes.
Out of order.
In order to do that, let's take a step back and ask, why would we have a dopamine system
Sub 130
like this?
to the last
Why would
set.
we have a dopamine system
That's it
at
for
all?
today. Gotta go get ready
We have
for
to
work.
remember
Drink my
what
protein,
our
brekkie
species'
shake.
primary interest is.
Put on my Insta
Our
if anyone wants to look
species,
for that one.
like all species, has a main interest, and that's to make more of itself. It's not just about sex and reproduction. It's about foraging for resources. Resources can be food, it can be water, it can be salt, can be shelter, can be social connection. Dopamine is the universal currency of foraging and seeking. We sometimes talk about motivation and craving, but what we mean in the evolutionary adaptive context, what we mean is foraging and seeking water, seeking food, seeking mates, seeking things that make us feel good and avoiding things that don't make us feel good, but in particular seeking things that will provide sustenance and pleasure in the short term and will extend the species in the long term. Once we understand that dopamine is a driver for us to seek things, it makes perfect sense as to why it would have a baseline level and it would have peaks, and that the baseline and peaks would be related in some sort of direct way. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say that you were not alive now, but you were alive 10,000 years ago. and you woke up and you looked and you realized you had minimal water and you had minimal food left. Maybe you have a child, maybe you have a partner, maybe you're in an entire village, but you realize that you need things, okay? You need to be able to generate the energy to go seek those things. And chances are there were dangers in seeking those things. Yes, it could be saber-toothed tigers and things of that sort, but there are other dangers too. There's the danger of a cut to your skin that could lead to infection. There's the danger of storms. There's the danger of cold. There's the danger of leaving your loved ones behind. So you go out and forage, right? You could be hunting, you could be gathering, or you could be doing both. The going out and foraging process was, we are certain, driven by dopamine. I mean, there's no fossil record of the brain, but these circuits have existed, we know, for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, and they are present in every animal. Not just mammals, but even in little worms like C. elegans. The same process. It's mediated by dopamine. So dopamine drives you to go out and look for things. And then let's say you find a couple berries, oh, these ones are rotten, these ones are good. Maybe you hunt an animal and kill it, or you find an animal that was recently killed and you decide to take the meat. You are going to achieve, or I should say experience, some sort of dopamine release. You found the reward, that's great. But then it needs to return to some lower level. Why? Well, because if you just stayed there, you would never continue to forage for more. It doesn't just increase your baseline and then stay there, it goes back down. And what's very important to understand is that it doesn't just go back down to the level it was before, it goes down to a level below what it was before you went out seeking that thing. Now this is counterintuitive. We often think, oh, okay, I'm gonna pursue the win, right? Let's move this to modern day. I'm gonna run this marathon. I'm gonna train for this marathon. Then you run the marathon, you cross the finish line, you feel great. And you would think, okay, now I'm set for the entire year. I'm gonna feel so much better. I'm gonna feel this accomplishment in my body. It's gonna be so great. That's not what happens. You might feel some of those things, but your level of dopamine has actually dropped below baseline. Now, eventually it will ratchet back up. But two things are really important. First of all, the extent to which it drops below baseline is proportional to how high the peak was. So if you cross the finish line pretty happy, it won't drop that much below baseline afterward. If you cross the finish line ecstatic, well, a day or two later, you're going to feel quite a bit lower than you would otherwise. You might not be depressed because it depends on where that baseline was to begin with. But the so-called postpartum depression that people experience after giving birth or after some big win, a graduation, or any kind of celebration, that postpartum drop in mood and affect and motivation is the drop in baseline dopamine. This is very important to understand because this happens on very rapid timescales and it can last quite a long time. It also explains the behavior that most of us are familiar with of engaging in something that we really enjoy, going to a restaurant that we absolutely love, or engaging in some way with some person that we really, really enjoy. But if we continue to engage in that behavior over and over again, it kind of loses its edge. It starts to kind of feel less exciting to us. Some of us experience that drop in excitement more quickly and more severely than others, but everyone experiences that to some extent. And this has direct roots in these evolutionarily conserved circuits. Some of you may be hearing this and think, no, that's not how it works for me. I'm just riding higher and higher all the time. I love my kids. I love my job. I love school. I love wins. I don't want losses. I agree. We all feel good when we are achieving things, but oftentimes we
Alright, boys. Done for the day. Hour and 9 minutes. Crazy. I thought I was a bit faster than that, but it is what it is. Done. Gotta get ready for work. Next workout won't be till Friday morning, I assume. But yeah, not much to say. I know, glad to be back. I'm so tired right now. That's what happens. Like, I just had a bit of a big weekend, didn't work out on Monday, and you feel the effect of it, but you know, just gotta get back into it. As much as it sucks, I'll feel better for it later today.
that's why I do my workouts in the morning now, I guess. As long as you just fit it out through the end of the day. But you know, you get the hardest part of the day out of the way, then the rest of the day seems a bit much easier. Anyway, gonna do my shake, gonna take a cold shower. I'm gonna try to get back into that, but we'll see what it is. I've done it before. I did it for like a year and a half, but I thought, oh, is it really helping me? But now, unfortunately, this nerdy, smarty pants science guy that I listen to is like, no, there's science behind it, Daniel. There's science behind it. I'm just like, damn it. Damn you, science. Anyway, till next time, you guys take care. Thanks for joining. Thanks for the push-ups. Thanks for following. Take care of yourselves, and hopefully till Friday. My streaming regime been a bit sporadic. Work just gets me in once in a while. That's it. Nothing I can do. Yeah. Anyway, till next time. Take care.